Welcome to another edition of the Subseasonal Forecast Contest. Today is January 26th. We're doing the forecast here Tuesday at 10:30. And the target date is our 16 to 20 day period, Feb 10th, Feb 14th. And I'm your host today, Dave Margolin. All right, let's see. And it looks like we just had someone else join here. For today's agenda, I think we have our usual sort of items, attribution, we can talk about the CFS and the CFS performance here. And it's nice. I think actually we just got Dave D'Arcangelo joined. So last week we asked another industry guest about the CFS performance this winter. So maybe we can get Dave's perspective too. And then talk about today's forecast. And yeah, as we were talking about offline, I feel like, and maybe this is more feel and opinion, but today's forecast is pretty interesting. With the fact that we've had the recent stratospheric warming, with the fact that we've got a pretty animated MJO, the fact that we've got still forecasts that are relatively warm. I feel like today there's the table set there to have a wide variety of opinion ranging from pretty cold to pretty warm. So we'll see how that goes. Other than those agenda items for today, are there any other I don't know, things that folks would like to talk about? Okay. No? Well,
No.
something comes up, let me know. All right, so yeah, let's take a look at the most recent verification. I think I had it up here, or maybe I closed it. So that was from 5th. Yeah, there we go. So, and I'll sort this. So this is this is the forecast made from Jan 5th and verified January 20th to the 24th, so just a couple days ago. The verification was 143, just about 143, and the 30-year and 10-year are up here, 153 and 150. So certainly warmer than the normals. And I think, as Dr. Decker pointed out just a minute ago, the CFS continues its string, at least within our forecast contest, which obviously we only have forecasts issued once a week, but performed slightly better actually than the ECMWF. The CFS had a forecast of a center line of just about 154, while the EC was at almost 157. So slightly better performance from the CFS, but hey, it's I'd rather be on the right side of things, right? And looking at some of the best performers here, the MJO analog actually did well, did the best of our inputs here at the top. And then looks like in terms of human forecast, Dr. Decker and myself did pretty well. Sean also in terms of the students. And then I guess this was an interesting forecast, and maybe Dave D'Arcangelo can talk a little bit about it here too. You can see we had a wide range. Matt Rogers, who normally does pretty well, and Professor Lupo, who I think at least up to this forecast was running at the top in terms of the CRPS this heating season. I think he was one of the top performers, if not the top performer. So it looks like he had a tough time kind of betting on the cold this forecast. Let's just see, before we open it up, let's just look at the Dynacast here. Let's look at the map and see how that looked. And then we can also look at the forecast maps and see how that looked here too, just to get some perspective. What did I do? Sometimes you need to,
You want January instead of
yeah,
February.
exactly. Sometimes you need to get the right date. That's the answer. Trying to blame the system. All right, let's just make sure that lines up. Yeah, 143, I think that's what we said. There's the 10-year, the 30-year, and there's the map again. So average temperature departure. So, around the corners a little bit, the northwest corner a little bit cool, a little bit of pockets of cool toward the northeast third of the country, and then up the gut, and then down south and southeast. looks like it was generally above normal temperatures anyway. So thus the I guess the warmer than normal. And let's take a look at the hemispheric pattern too, from a jet streamer 500 millibar perspective. Let's see how that looked. It's a little cleaner when you look at it from the upper levels. There's the hemispheric, a lot of negative AO there, but just not quite enough to push that cool around the edges of the country, right? But not quite enough to, penetrate far enough south so that HDDs were above normal. And then let's look at the globe. Here's the globe look, right? So, again, interesting, a lot of blocking, a lot of negative AO. This is something Michael's been talking about for a while. The fact that we've had all this negative AO, but in some cases, it seems like we haven't been able to realize some of the cold potential, at least in our neck of the woods, in the eastern 2/3 of the United States. And then let's take a look at the maps. Let me see if I have the maps here, just from a hemispheric. Well, we'll look at it both. Do I got the right date? Yeah, this is the right date. So we'll pull up the EC 2-meter temperature first. Yeah, okay. Huh. We'll pull up the hemispheric to what's a global. Let's do the global. It doesn't look as bad, but I guess details matter. CFS, surface temperature. Okay, interesting. And then CFS global. All right, and then let's go tweak one more. Let's go back to, where's that Dynacast? There it is. Or Dynacast. Interesting when you look at like the ECM. All right, so I don't know, thoughts, anyone want to add their 2 cents here in terms of thoughts on this forecast verification?
It looks like, just from seeing the EC and CFS Global 500, it looks like both models missed that trough in the West Coast. Doesn't look like it affected temperature that much, but just interesting that they both seem to have missed it. Just looking at the 500 millibar departures.
Yeah, and then the ridge up the gut, right? And that detail was hugely important, in particular with the EC, right? So it's sort of like the trough split, one piece, like you said, down the coast, a little bit in the northeast, but up the gut, we had a lot up the gut, meaning middle part of the country. We had a lot more ridging, right? And it seemed like from an HDD and temperature perspective, that was an important, difference, if you will, because it allowed for a lot of important cities like St. Louis, Kansas City, maybe Chicago a little bit, not to be as cold.
Yeah.
What do you think, Dave? I think you're on the line here. It looked like, you were kind of thinking a little bit colder than this. Looking back, what do you think? I don't know, are there any particular lessons learned from this, or is this one of those, like, these are the kind of details that are really hard to pick out 16 to 20 days out?
Hey, Dave, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just sat down. I had loaded you, but I just sat down, a minute ago, so I didn't really catch the beginning. I just heard my name called. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The only answer, I mean, I'm been frustrated by this pattern as much as probably anyone out there. The weird thing is, if you forecast warm every year for the last 10 years, you've been pretty much right. So it's just one of those things. It's just getting increasingly frustrated to be a macro long range forecaster in this environment. Especially when you've seen in late December and early January how cold it got in East Asia, how cold we're getting in parts of Western Europe, Central and Western Europe, and you're just not seeing it kind of seeing it progress through the North America, and maybe, we're seeing it now in the, next few weeks, potentially a little bit, but, even then you're getting only in pockets. The Pacific remains in a state which has just been really highly antagonistic towards getting cold in any meaningful fashion. I think really like the La Nina based state, and kind of, a tropical activity that's been kind of fixed on Indonesia or just east of Indonesia has just largely been hostile to getting cold. And particularly too, you got a, fairly warm North Pacific. And when you combine that, then I think you've just got, the ingredients just really aren't there. Not that you can't get a few, days here or there. And again, 16 to 20 day, I think we've learned pretty accurately that there's not a lot of skill there. And sometimes you have to have a really big imagination. I think that's one thing that always surprises me when I look back on 16 to 20 day verification is like, wow, your imagination is never really big enough.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And outlier solutions are much more common than we like to think. The spread of possible outcomes is way wider than the models would have you imply. So the way I've tried to play this is try to be like, not very far from maybe normal, so to speak, but I try to play with a very wide distribution, and that's questionable how helpful that is. And we can probably get into a longer philosophical discussion about, how you should portray risk and uncertainty. And I in this scheme of what we're trying to do with this contest is maybe I've really quite got a handle on it, but no real big takeaways. I mean, maybe those are some big takeaways. I don't know. Maybe somebody thinks they're not, but if I'm frustrated, if I sound frustrated, it's because I am.
Well, and that's good to know, right? In the sense that obviously we don't want you frustrated, but it's good to know that from a market perspective here, I suspect you're speaking for others, in the field and stuff. And I think it speaks to how challenging these forecasts are, and even in situations where you feel like maybe, okay, we've got a stratospheric warming, we've got all these pieces, the models are there. Sometimes still it finds ways to kind of, throw a twist into things. Like you said, I thought you brought up a great point too about how these models are sort of under dispersed still. And there's a significant amount of under dispersion, i.e. that the distributions are wider than just are explicitly given by the ensembles, and that you have to have an imagination, for that. You can't just assume that that the answer is within the distribution.
Yeah, too, there's a lot of things that operate, at different time scales. And I think one thing we've always struggled with, and where models struggle with it, and humans struggle with it, is too, that the handoff between relatively highly skilled, synoptic driven weather inside of 7 or 8 days, and then the seasonal look, which really is kind of the fingerprints of something that evolves over like several months to the season. That window, which we obviously call the subseasonal, that's a really wide window. That's like call it day 10 to day 40 probably. Or so. And even though you might, have a view which, dominates in the seasonal space, the intra week volatility is so dramatic. So that, there we are. And unfortunately the market that I forecast for, that, we trade around, is at the whim of that week to week volatility. And that's just really, it's kind of a weekly gut punch, as to how difficult that can be.
Yeah. And this, I was thinking we can maybe make a quicker shift today to the forecast, because I feel like there's still a lot of these problems, if you will, that maybe applied to today's forecast. I thought today's forecast was particularly interesting based on all the whipsaw we've seen, and then now you have also this MJO and such. But before we switch gears and talk about the forecast, is there, I don't know, anything else from Dr. Decker or Michael in terms of helpful, I don't know, lessons learned from this forecast this period?
I didn't submit a forecast for this period, but I would just say a helpful lesson just overall these past couple of weeks has been don't blindly trust the teleconnections because they haven't really done what they're supposed to do.
Is it, though, is that, I mean, not to play contrarian here, but I guess I am, or devil's advocate, but, you know, it's tricky though, right? Like, because, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I almost feel like there's a caveat there, and just to say, and I'm saying this too without having done any hard math. So but this is opinion, but I'm just looking at the map. The AO is negative, right? And there are, as Dave Darkangelo mentioned, there are parts of the world hemisphere which are normally highly correlate, significantly correlated with the AO, that are responding in that way, right? Western Europe, for example, here, right? I mean, this bomb low pressure, upper low over Western Europe. So, and we always say that, like Europe has a higher whatever correlation, spatial correlation with the AO, and in particular the NAO, than even Eastern North America. So, I do think it is worth looking at a little bit. I agree with you in the sense that, quote unquote, it didn't work out perfect in the East, but again, that is also why it's not a 1.0 correlation, right, with temperature and stuff. These are those situations, those 30-40% of the time, maybe it's 20%, I don't know, but where the AO is negative, but it doesn't get cold in Chicago. You know what I mean? So I don't know, Michael, I don't want to just leave it there. I'll turn it back over to you. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, that's true, but also I'll just kind of say that normally you would expect with a negative AO NAO regime, you would tend to expect, I'd say, 7 out of 10 times would expect a cold solution from that. Um, but didn't really, for most of the country anyway. Um, didn't really see that this time, and there was I think on our discussion on Friday, um, we kind of came to the conclusion that it was that massive trough stretching from central Russia all the way through Alaska, which seems in this one to have abated a little bit. Um, so who knows? Maybe it'll switch and the NA was heading to
But
positive.
and by the way, just as a research exercise, right? I'm just trying to think of something productive that could come from this. And yeah, I think you're talking about this. Greg Stanko, I think last time
Yeah.
mentioned that maybe or something. One thing we could look at, and it could be you, Michael. It would be interesting, and there's more sophisticated and probably less sophisticated ways to do this that I think are still helpful, is to look at different let's say negative AO regimes, right? And look at those negative let's say it is 70-30. I don't know what the exact distribution is, but let's just go with it. That 70% of the time AO is negative, and it gets coldish in the east directionally. Um, look at those negative AO regimes, start there, a subset there, like if you had an index, and then break it into categories. Into categories, you could do this either by 500 millbar height or temperature, but let's just say temperature. You look at those, then you subset by negative AO where the temperatures were warmer than normal, like this, in the heating, the natural HDDs or whatever. And then you try to look at those events, right? Maybe on Ezrail, or you create a composite of those dates, and you try to see if you see those reoccurring regimes. Are there certain patterns that are consistent with the AO being negative, but the temperature pattern being positive, i.e., hey, this trough over Northern Asia or this ridge over the East Pac? That might be a helpful exercise, because then you might be able to, as an analog technique, you might be able to see it a little bit better. I have no idea what the results would show. And of course, the results may not be productive, but it is something that you could look into. Okay. Before we switch gears to forecast, I know Philip just joined us too. And Philip, I know you just caught the end of that, but we were just talking about, and Dave Darkangelo was just talking about how, this has been a really kind of frustrating period. There have been times where it looks like the forecast, and you could see it by, let me sort this by forecast mean. there have been forecasts that have been pretty cold by a number of us over the past couple weeks, and then it seems like there's been obviously some of these forecasts are verifying warmer. This forecast in particular verified at 143, so warmer than the normals. Michael was just talking about how, hey, you've had negative AO galore, and yet at least in the eastern half of the country, we haven't been able to get any kind of consistent cold. And then finally, Dave Darkangelo, and this is going to be a segue into our forecast, but talking about, well, and then looking at the current forecast, there's been more volatility and maybe some hints that there could be cold coming. I don't know. I know there's a lot there, but Philip, in terms of your evaluation of the last couple of weeks and stuff, anything that you want to add before we switch over to the forecast?
Nothing really to add. It certainly has seemed warmer than I expected.
Right.
Oh, but while you're loading up the current forecast or whatever, one thing I was thinking was, the MJO analog, you never have an extreme, it's usually pretty close to normal, but as far as, the departures from normal go, it was a decent departure and it was a correct departure with the current, verified forecast. I'm wondering if, if you break down things like a strong negative AO and, are these situations where the negative AO, at least for North America, isn't so important or not as correlated? Is there some association with there being a decent, MJO signal? In other words, meaning not that the MJO is necessarily outside of the circle of death or anything, but just the analog is decently far away from 30-year normal.
No, sorry. What was the question there, though?
Well, it was more. There's no answer to the question.
Okay.
I wonder if you were to analyze all these negative AO events, would the events where there is less of an impact on North America be related to having a decently strong MJO analog signal?
Yeah.
Where the signal being strong doesn't mean necessarily that you're outside of the circle of death, but just it means that you're in one of those pockets where you have either a big blue dot or a big red dot in our analog plots. Basically.
Yeah.
Does that override more often than not these teleconnections like the AO for North America?
Yeah, I think, does anyone have any thoughts on that, like Dave or Philip? Because I think that would be a really interesting exercise too, to be able to say, all right, let's look at, obviously we have like MJO all cases, right? Something like this, that there's no filter for anything. But then, how does the response, let's say across North America, change from MJO as a function of AO, starting from, say, a really negative AO to a really positive AO? Is it a linear type response? What kind of constructive or deconstructive interference does the extratropics, in particular the AO, have with the MJO? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Hey, Dave, I'll weigh in real quick.
Yeah.
So it's pretty clear that for North America, at least, the tropical forcing has been pretty hostile and had been a pretty big headwind to cold. Yes, that if you look at it looks like it's been in the circle of death, but when you look at like the low frequency component of like, say, something like 200 millibar velocity potential, you see a fairly fixed static feature of forcing that's been roughly equivalent of phase 4 or 5 because it's been sitting in the eastern maritime continent and far western Pacific. It's very much a fixture of La Nina winters. So that clearly has been a headwind. With regards to the AO, and looking at samples of the AO, this has been something that Dave, you and I batted around maybe 8-9 years ago. With regards to a warmer climate regime that we've clearly been in for the last few decades, there's always been this question, and it's tough to analyze because your sample size is so tiny. When you look at the history of AOs, you may have to kind of almost think about it in terms of climate regime, maybe pre-mid 1990s or late 1990s and post. Clearly, AOs are not acting, and this is true of a lot of teleconnections, but AOs and NAOs in particular are not acting like the AOs you'd see across the entire time series of data going back to, say, 1950. There's maybe a potential impact. I'm just spitballing here, but there may be an impact to you know, the action or reaction of the weather to, you know, AOs of any sort, but particularly negative AOs and NAOs are different under a warmer climate regime like we're in than they may have been in the past. So what you're challenged by, if you think that, and I'm inclined to think that that is true, but that one of the things that you are challenged by is you know, you're really working from a very limited data set once you start breaking it up like that. But that's just a thought.
Yeah. Those are good points too. And, you know, we sometimes think of like the AO as a static feature, but, you know, right, the climate's obviously changed a lot over the last 30, 40 years. And maybe the response, you know, we typically look at, you know, these correlations that like Michael and I are talking about are like, you know, 50-year, 60-year correlations, 1950 to 2000 or 2000, whatever. And, you know, when you start to subset by different decades and stuff, that I think the relationship may change. And it may be interesting too. We may be able to do like spatial. I was looking the other day at spatial, the 500 millibar. I don't know if I can pull it up right now. I was doing it in Python, but spatial correlation of La Nina, like the top 10 La Ninas versus the jet stream pattern. And then so I took that as a composite, but then I looked at the individual years. The assumption, the hypothesis being that this year hasn't been behaving in a canonical type way, like we haven't seen as much. And it did turn out, for what it's worth, that the correlation, spatial correlation, November and December was very low as compared to years like 88 and 2010 and some of these other years. But my point my point is it could be interesting to do something similar with the AO and kind of looking at it on a more decadal or 20-year moving average and see how that the spatial and correlations with surface temperatures are evolving and changing and stuff. But it still goes back to I still, you know, back to what Dr. Decker was saying. I like that. I think that would be an interesting. It might, yeah, it's certainly possible in our list of things where we could look at. I think it would be interesting, right? You when I think about Dr. Decker's question, and obviously there's different ways to skin a cat, so to speak, but you don't want to, I think, just look at it explicitly by what am I thinking here? Anomaly, right? Because of course, if you have a base state of negative AO, if we had, imagine if we had three plots here, one is the current plot, and then one where the AO is negative, and another one where the AO is positive. You know, you would assume that the where the AO is negative, the anomaly response is going to be, you know, not as, or it's going to be colder, just in net colder or less warm. And so, but it might be interesting to look at the change, right? So what's the change from the base state to 16 to 20 days later? Because that could tell you something about in terms of whether it's constructive or deconstructive interference. In other words, does maybe it is that when the AO is negative and you have an MGO phase 6, you get an acceleration of cold. You get even a greater change toward cold from the base state, right? So, you know, if today is the pattern's like +2, and then you go to a -20, you know, versus a +2 to a -10, the acceleration, if you will, the change is greater when the let's say the AO is negative. Anyway, we might be able to look at something like that, which may again tell us about how the extratropics and tropics are either working together constructively or working kind of against each other. All right, anyone else have any thoughts on those topics there before we move on? All right. So, Dr. Decker, too, I just wanted to come back, or maybe it was Dave who brought this up too, but I was just thought, yeah, let's look at the bias real quick. And this is the bias this heating season. And for sure, it does seem like most of us, almost all of us, have some degree of, I guess this is a cold bias, right? You know, some of 10, 12. So definitely it seems like thus far, I'm at close to 8. Some of us are over 10. So definitely it does, you know, worth noting, right, that there definitely does seem to be a cold bias. More with some of us. Looks like, you know, Dave, you're quite a bit lower there, and then the CFS and some of the ECMWF is even lower still. So, but just thought I'd bring that up. All right, let's switch gears and look at the forecast. And yeah, Dr. Decker, I think, was alluding to this too. I thought this was interesting just before we hand it off to folks. The MGO analog, this has to be one of the most anomalous forecasts I've seen from the MGO analog, for what it's worth. It is at 152. It's almost 10 HDDs colder than the 30-year normal. And I sort of spot checked that because I was like, wow, that was big. But remember what we were just looking at, it's based on the initialized MJO, and the initialized MJO is right about here, right? We just kind of looked at that. And you can see that that works out to be, looking at our scale here, about 10 HDDs above normal. So just the sanity check on that seems to be like that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, for what it's worth. All right, and then with that, looking at our range of forecast here, and then we'll open it up. We've got a 180 from the CFS. If you include humans, I guess that's me at 156. And then down to the persistence, long-term persistence, which is pretty warm because overall the winter thus far has been warmer than normal. Looking at the human forecast, you've got Paul Roundy at 128. So a decent spread here. And by the way, with the CFS, I think I showed this just before the meeting started, but if you want to see why it's so cold, you see here, but incredible amount of run-to-run volatility, as Dave was sort of alluding to. Of course, I think Dave was talking about the shorter range models, but even with these medium range models, just one run to one run here is pretty crazy. So, all right, so who would like to kind of kick us off and talk about their forecast process here?
I can go first.
Sure, Michael. Would you like to screen?
No, that's okay. I don't have
All right,
much to toss in here, but okay. So
it's Michael's forecast.
okay, so I started off my usual way by multiplying the normal 10-year average by 0.7 and adding that to the EC forecast and multiplying the EC forecast by 0.3. And that got me to the value of 140.7 as my starting point. Took a look at the CPC forecast, shows a lot of warmth in the East Coast, stretching all the way to Chicago. So a lot of major cities in the warmth there. So lowered the HDDs a little bit for that, and lowered them a little bit more based on the teleconnections. I know there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not how much they should be trusted, but with the NAO heading back towards positive, if there is any cold, it probably won't be in the eastern half, and I think that's what the CPC is starting to see as well as some other factors, I'm sure. So that got me to a value of 133.7 with an average spread of 23.2. Any comments, complaints, questions, concerns? And that's my map of normal in the east, averaging out in the west coast and most of the central U.S. and below normal in the west central. I'm not sure which
Just to be
mountain
clear,
region.
Michael, you mean above normal temperatures, below normal demand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see red on a map, and I immediately say above normal.
Okay, so Michael's on the warmer. Looks like on the warmer side, right? Warmer than the ECMWF, warmer than CFS for sure. Okay. Let's see. Philip, did you make a forecast today?
I am in the last stages of submitting my forecast, so
Okay,
I'll have that soon.
Yeah, we can let you finish there. Dave, you still on the line? Would you like to talk about your process at all?
No, I don't want to talk about my process. I want to say something. I want to say one more thing before, and obviously I don't want to take the floor from other people, but The one thing that's been interesting about this winter is how boring it's been. So while there's been a lot of moving parts, right? We've had, this pretty strong La Nina, big stratospheric event, and we've had cold in some parts of the world. The bottom line for North America, when you look at actualized weather, is how much little volatility there's been. And that is, to me, has been a very interesting feature. It's just been almost every day. You can pick out almost any city, and the inability to see anything but like +4 is really remarkable, right? Like there's been no weather to speak of, very little to no weather, and very little volatility. That's just an aside to, we have all these moving parts and all these forecast challenges. In general, it's just verified above average, not as warm as, last winter. And it frankly has been grindingly boring from an actualization standpoint. Just an observation.
And I'm curious, though, do you think and by the way, it feels that way. I mean, I'm just doing the local perspective here, and a guy in northern New Jersey. But I hear, and you're not too far from me. And I mean, it has been kind of I definitely feel that locally too. We had one storm and I get a little here, and it hasn't been too warm, but we haven't had any really cold days either. I mean, it's been a little bit above, it's been a little warmer than normal, but not like, it's not like I'm out in my shorts. But yeah, it's been boring. You're right. A lot of days in the 40s over here, a couple days in the 50s, a couple days in the 30s. So I hear what you're saying. But do you feel that is, based on what you said earlier about like some other places of the hemisphere, like China and Russia and Europe and stuff like that, do you think it's just kind of a coincidence that it's happening here? Obviously, it's an important area, the United States, from demand, but like that it's not necessarily a hemispheric or global feature. It's just whatever, the stars align such that we're not getting real volatile here, but other places are? Or what do you think?
It could be just that it's a North America feature, this pattern of the Pacific, which is it's really been kind of almost, a constant drumbeat of a fast North Pacific jet, somewhat driven by like the low frequency La Nina, tropical forcing. And it's just not allowed you to get that volatility. And maybe it's that feature of too, you've got the warm North Pacific waters, central North Pacific, and this cold La Nina feature. And so you just haven't really budged that. And, other parts of the world are much more influenced by things like Siberian highs and blocking peak patterns, right? Like Europe is much more prone to that. And we're just, we're not, when the Pacific is, in a fairly fixed space state. I don't want to get into kind of larger theories of kind of like lack of volatility, because there's been plenty of examples of it, even in, the past 6 winters, which have all been above normal in the United States. We've had a couple of very cold stretches. 17 and 18 both had remarkably cold 2 and 3 week stretches against like long-term average, even though the winters ended up mild. This winter is just, you're right, it's mild, but not exceedingly. So we've had much warmer periods the last 5 years. If you want to live in a climate regime of 40s every day and 20s every night, this has been the winter for you.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's an interesting study in itself. I mean, again, for anyone, in particular of our student members here who want to look at that, it'd be interesting to look at the volatility, not the actual verified, like temperature, day-to-day variability, I guess is a better word, not volatility, but variability, either from a national HDD or regionally, some of these regions, and just see how it compares to some other years. But and then B, just to see if there's anything we can tie it to. Can we tie it to La Nina and some other kind of regime so that we can better predict it in the future? That'd be interesting. Okay.
I'll just throw in,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
looked up the temperature data from New Brunswick so far this month. And we're running 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit above normal for January. But the range isn't that extreme, given January, often you have these really, as you were mentioning, right, big fluctuations, but the range is from a +13 to a -1 departure for any given day. So as far as January goes, that doesn't seem like you're saying too outlandish.
Yeah, yeah, that is interesting. And I haven't. Again, it would be really interesting. Yeah, it's another thing on our list of little studies that maybe one of us can get to. But it would be interesting to kind of categorize that a little bit and to see how this year does compare to some other years in terms of the amount of variability, and then start there, and then does it confirm our suspicions, and then B, is there anything we can tie to, or is it just one of those things that's beyond the limits of the science right now? I don't know. Okay, let's see. Philip or Dr. Decker, do you care to share any of your forecast thoughts?
Well, the CPC was already mentioned, so I guess I could just briefly say, as always, I'm just turning that CPC map into a forecast. It was relatively warm, except for kind of the northern Rockies and Pacific Northwest, but by far the populated areas are more red than blue, including Chicago, barely, and everything along the East Coast. So I did weight the warm more than the cold a little bit, so my HDs are below the normal. A little bit, those probabilities aren't that huge. I thought it was kind of funny that in their discussion, which I think they write these on Fridays, so they mentioned there's a lot of good agreement between the various dynamical models, at least on Friday. And so it's kind of amusing to me that the CFS isn't even agreeing with itself, at least now. Maybe it was agreeing with itself on Friday, but definitely not the most recent one.
Well, that's an interesting point. And Dave, you can speak more to this, but I think I've seen it, like just even looking at the day-to-day volatility the past couple days, seems like the intra 15-day models have been shifting colder and such. So there's been, over the last couple days, is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's true. That's a trend that goes back to roughly Friday.
Okay.
Friday's 12Z models, which is the net move has been to the colder side. That's right.
And I guess I forgot, but everyone should have access to this too. So if you could kind of sometimes see this. Here's the EC ensemble, so you could kind of, at least from the last. Well, this only goes back a couple days, but you can see a little bit of that. Okay, Philip, are you ready on your end?
Yeah, if you quickly refresh, it should show up.
There he is.
All right.
Last but not least.
All right. So it turns out, I think my forecast ends up looking qualitative in terms of regionally. It looks similar to what everyone else is. But I guess when I add up all my numbers, that's how I get to my slightly colder than average HDD count. So slightly above average HDD count. And looking at the tropical convection, as was mentioned already, we have the MJO signal around phase 7 with the models not very clear on where it's going, where it sort of loops it in that area and maybe pushes it towards 8. So the lag composites for phase 7 suggest building cold as you increase the number of lags. And we have the MJO analog that is going seriously cold. So overall, my tropics was a slightly cold signal that ends up being the coldest of all my signals. The CPC, as already mentioned, is suggesting a warmer condition. And the models, as we met, for the teleconnections, as we noted, the AO continues to be consistently negative on the model forecast, with the NAO, PNA, and EPO much less certain. So I treat that as only a weekly cold signal. And as already was mentioned, the models, the dynamical guidance has quite a bit of disagreement, especially with the CFS being very inconsistent. So the CFS number ends up being near the climatological mean, and that is a typo. It is not 179.8. But the EC is, as we mentioned, is very warm in the east and slightly cold in the west, so that's below normal heating demand. And putting everything together, I actually ended up with a forecast that is very similar to Maxar's map and numbers. And I just subtracted a 0.5 HDD fudge factor for warmer concerns.
Okay. Questions for Philip? I guess yeah, I can talk about my forecast a little bit. I guess I'm colder, 156. And I did add a pretty significant fudge factor. My normal forecast formula is here, and then I added 10. And I guess I added 10 because, well, the MJO analog, which I felt like I needed to put more weight. Was a really strong signal, and I guess I felt like the MJO, not just the way it's initialized, but also the way it's forecast. It looks to me like it's about as good a signal as you see from the MJO in terms of it's coming out in phase 6, and we know, based on our, I mean, it's literally in the peak area for cold, and it's expected to slowly drift over to phase 7. And on top of that, we're seeing, can we see, did I have it open? Yeah, you're starting to see a little bit of that classic kind of SPCZ look here that I've seen. Again, some of this is a little bit subjective. It's qualitative slash subjective. So when I saw this, the fact that the AO is already negative, the fact that we've seen, the models start to crack a little bit, and I thought even like the CFS kind of show maybe that Rossby wave action dispersion that sometimes that happens. I said to myself, well, this looks to me like there's a significant amount of risk skew that are to the cold side, and by that I mean that outliers, like the outlier risks, are to the cold side. And so I tried to plug that into my mean, and that's what got my mean forecast to the cold side. But I guess I'm a little surprised, and this is, I guess, where a question on my end. I felt like, hey, Matt Rogers, who, notoriously, right, has a reputation for being a little bit cold, no, he doesn't see it. And Maxar doesn't see it. And, Dave D'Arcangelo, I don't, is not there. So it just makes me wonder. I thought there would be more folks that at least thinking, hey, the dam could break here, but clearly that's not the case. So I guess that my question is, what do you think? Why what's wrong with my rationale here? Anyone have any thoughts?
Hey, Dave, you want to
Yeah,
tell
yeah,
you where
go.
you're wrong?
Yeah, please.
No, I think that you're great. I think I like your rationale, and the MGO moving into what looks like phase 7 is actually somewhat compelling. It's the first such move we've had this winter, and there does look to be a breakdown of the tropical forcing, right? It looks like we're going to move, and that's a reflection of phase 7 reflects that, right? We're going to lose this deep convective look over like the eastern part of Indonesia and kind of disperse it eastward across the Pacific, which should disrupt the long wave pattern. The one thing I'm not seeing in the models, which is a little bit troublesome, is we're not getting the ridge to fire over Alaska, right? The ridge is still firing off to the north, the west and north of it, like west central, the north central Pacific, into more of what would be far northeast Russia. We're not really seeing that look, and that's a little bit troubling. I'm not sure why the models aren't showing that. Yeah, that look right there, right, which is, that's that La Nina-esque North Pacific ridge, and we're not really getting it to fire, over the northern part of Alaska and that part of the Arctic. So that's, maybe that's a headwind, and maybe that's a reason why the southeast ridge can fire back. But I'm not sure why the ridging isn't going there, right? Phase 7, should support that. Phase 8 should support it pretty well too if we get in there in 3 weeks. But modeling just isn't reflective of that yet.
And I would say my, I looked at this, and of course, I don't look at this as much as Dave does and stuff. So, my thoughts probably worth what you paid for them. But I don't know why this is not updating right now. Looks like it just got stuck. But I was just gonna say, Dave, I guess as a maybe one counterpoint, and granted, I'm relying on the CFS here, which is not great, but my concern is a little bit. See if this reloads. Well, I'll just talk through it as it's trying to reload. Um, when I looked at some of the runs of the CFS, in the 6 to 10 day period. I thought I was seeing some hints there, some solutions showing that ridge expanding north and east into Alaska a little bit more. And whereas you're right, and that's kind of what you look for. One of the features, triggers, telltale signs you might look for to see if that um, to see if the MJO is starting to sync up a little bit with the extratropics. So I saw that, and that to me was like, a little bit more motivation. And then I guess the reason why, in my mind, anyway, again, subjective, or somewhat subjective, experiential anyway, I felt like the EC has a little bit of a bias to lock in that anomalous ridging. I think there's a bias, a long-term bias in the East Central Pacific. And so my concern was that the EC may be slower in picking up that Rossby wave dispersion, that energy, that ridging amplification north and east toward the Gulf of Alaska and Alaska. So that's the way I played it anyway. My thoughts.
It did look before your maps here froze up, or Max froze up, that really cold CFS run did have a monster ridge over Alaska and the Gulf, or Bering Sea.
Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah, exactly. I thought so too a little bit. So I don't know. Let me see if I can pull it up anywhere else. I don't know if this is working either. Let's see.
I can't get Maxar to load either.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
thought I'd also add though that the 179.8 was not a typo apparently. So the value that we have for the CFS in our system is 179.8, which is a little different when I was looking at Maxar's report, where the CFS, because the way they calculate the numbers are a little different, the CFS number is actually only 147.79, which is not that far from the 30-year mean.
That's right. This is not. I don't think that I don't think this is an error. There's just tremendous variability, or run-to-run volatility, I guess is the right word, in the CFS run. So the 0Z, we always pick the 0Z, or select the 0Z, and that was a really cold. But you're right. The way Maxar displays it in the report is, I think, an average of the last 10 runs. So that's a good point. So. Yeah, so it looks like I know we're out of time, and I don't want to keep anyone. So, but yeah, it looks like this is going to be this is a really interesting forecast. There's been, as we discussed at length, I think a lot of surprises, and things haven't exactly been behaving, and questions about the La Nina's impact, teleconnections, AO's impact, MGO's impact, and stuff like that. So I think the next couple of weeks it'll be interesting to see how this kind of plays out. Before we run out of time, is there any last words from anyone here?
The only thing I'll say is I'm rooting for you to be right, Dave, because I'm kind of tired of this weather pattern of nothingness.
Same.
It has been
Although
boring.
it is nice to see that it is actually snowing outside for a change, but I'm not expecting much, so.
I know. It was looking good a couple days ago, or looking better anyway. And then, oh well, just like last time. And we got screwed a little bit last time with the sleet and ice. I mean, we still got a decent snowfall. What was that, back in, what was it, early December or whenever it was,
Yeah.
mid-December? I mean, we got decent snowfall, but that darn sleet came in and kind of ruined it. So. Okay. All right. Well, I'll let you guys go. I think it was a good discussion, a lot of different ideas and stuff. Thanks for everyone for participating, and we'll see you again next week. Bye, guys.
Dave.
Thank you.
Bye.